Hey everybody, it's K-Ball here from ZURB. With the recent release of Foundation 6.4, we did a series of free trainings on the amazing new XY grid. Those trainings filled up so fast, not everyone had the opportunity to get into one. So in a moment, you're going to see a recording of one of those trainings. If you want to learn more, if you want to go deeper, if you want to become a master of responsive web development using Foundation, check out one of our upcoming paid trainings. These trainings are interactive webinars with the core team that builds and uses Foundation every day. Click on the link in the corner to learn more, and in the meantime, enjoy this recording. So today we are going to be talking about the new XY grid that is shipped as part of Foundation 6.4. The XY grid is a super powerful new grid that we built, and it was inspired by CSS grid. The XY grid is not CSS grid, but what happened is we were playing around with CSS grid, and we absolutely love it. It's incredibly powerful. It really got our heads spinning about the possibilities when you can control things so well, both horizontally and vertically, and you get really good control over the way things lay out. But when we started talking with the community about implementing CSS grid within Foundation and doing things with it, one of the things that we ran into is the fact that as of right now, despite sort of the rapid increase in browsers supporting CSS grid early in this year, we had Chrome and Firefox and Safari all coming on within a couple months of each other, and we got very excited. But browser support has kind of stayed at that level where in the US market, about 60% of sessions right now of users doing stuff are in browsers that support CSS grid. And that's great. Beginning of this year, there was like less than 20%. So 60% is excellent. However, that's not really enough for any of the projects that we're doing where we're working with, production websites or web applications. It's not for most of our users who are targeting, business applications. We can't fully be onto CSS grid yet. But when we played with it, we got so excited. And so we started saying, what could we do today that we could use today that would get us part of the way there to that incredible power that we're seeing there? And that conversation evolved and turned into the XY grid. The XY grid is built using Flexbox, so that it is usable in production today. We actually, in the last webinar, it came up what percentage of browsers support CSS grid right now? And we looked on Can I Use? It's over 97% of traffic today is on browsers that support Flexbox. So it's usable in production, but it's super powerful, gets us a lot of the way there towards what CSS grid is going to enable. So what the XY grid is, it's Flexbox from the bottom up, which lets us enable things like auto and shrink sizing. It allows us control over the layout both in the X horizontal direction, which is the same as our more traditional grids, but then also in the Y direction, so you can control things vertically. It allows detailed control over cell margin and padding independently in each one of those dimensions. And it supports more advanced application style layouts with some classes like I call cell block, where we pulled in these concepts from the Foundation for Apps experiment, where you could have independent scrolling panels of content and integrated them into the XY grid. So continuing forward on the XY grid, the basics of the XY grid are very similar to Foundation's traditional grids. If you've been using the Foundation grids for a while, the basic use should be really simple to pick up. So if we look at what a traditional grid looked like in Foundation, you'd have a row, you'd have some columns inside of it, use some sizing classes to lay them out. In this case, you have, if we're assuming the default 12 columns, 2 columns that are equally sized. To change that over to the XY grid, we simply change a couple of class names. Row becomes grid X, columns become cells. Now, there's a couple reasons why we change the naming. The first reason, and the most important reason, is that when we started thinking about laying things out in both dimensions, and we were getting our heads around what does it mean to have one of these things vertically and how does that work, we found that the row and column nomenclature was really confusing. If you change to vertical, does that mean your columns on the outside and your rows are on the inside, or how does that work? And how does that end up translating into the CSS? And we found that the naming structure was more confusing than helpful. And so we shifted it. And columns became cells, no longer presupposing a dimensionality. The row and column nomenclature really comes from a world where you're laying things out horizontally and letting the browser take care of vertical. So columns became cells, and your row, if it's horizontal, became grid X. If you want it to be vertical, it becomes grid Y. But that's all you need to do to get your simple case ported over, with a couple of details that we're going to add on in just a sec, because there are some differences in defaults. But the core structure, this is what it looks like. However, it gets real fun real fast. So if we play with that idea a little bit, move forward, the first thing that we want to layer onto this concept is this independent control of margin or padding. The traditional Foundation grids are all padding based, meaning that the space between your content, the gutters, are implemented using padding on the columns, which has a couple of implications. It means that if you want content to be there with space between it, you actually need it to be nested inside of that. And it also meant that if you wanted to not have gutters between your columns, you needed to add a class, which is the expanded class. That led to some complications very quickly. If you started nesting things down and you had expanded inside of expanded, nest to non-expanded, nest another expanded in, all sorts of different things that folks wanted to do, complicated combinations, ended up very quickly getting into specificity hell. It was very hard to, lots of little corner case bugs and things like that. Take that problem that we learned from the old grid and the fact that now you can choose with the XY grid whether you're doing margin or padding. And we have our default grids in the XY grid have no space, no gutters. Cells do not have padding or margin, but then you layer that on with additional classes. So if you want to separate your cells with margin, you just layer on grid margin X. If you want to reproduce the traditional grid approach with padding, you add on grid padding X. You can actually control that in each of the X and Y dimensions. So this will become a lot more obvious if we start playing with it. So let's do exactly that. Here we have a simple example where we have a couple grids, one using margin, one using padding. And what you can see, the way that we've set this example up to make it clear is the grid itself has no background. The cell itself has a red background, and the demo div inside of the cell has a blue background. So you can see, actually, if you look down at the padding version, this is what you would get with a traditional Foundation grid. You would have the background from your columns, in that case, your cells in this case, forming the gutters between the content inside of it. That could cause some problems. Like, say, if you had cards that you were laying out in a grid, your cards always had to be nested inside of your columns rather than being on the column class itself. Otherwise, they'd be flush. With margin gutters, you get away from that problem. Margin gutters, the entire content of the cell is there, and the space between the cells is made via margin, so that your background's there ends up being the background from the grid, or in this case, since the grid itself has no background, the background of your body. Let's layer on some more things in this. I'm going to fork this real quick so I don't mess up my core demo. We'll call this the 2 p.m. version of this. Say I want to lay out more cells. And actually, I'm going to get rid of some of my demo styling to make this even clearer. So these no longer have a set height or anything like that. Their height is from the content. If I want to lay out more cells, just like in the traditional grids, I can continue adding cells, and they're going to wrap around and lay out appropriately. If I want to create vertical spacing between the rows of cells, in this case, within it, I can simply add grid margin Y, and I will get a vertical gutter in the same way that I had my horizontal gutter. So this makes things like the block grid, where you're laying out arbitrary amounts of content you want to have spacing between them, so much easier, so much more simple. You can also add both margin and padding. Like these things don't have to be independent. So I could take these cells and say I want to wrap every cell in some padding automatically. All I need to do is add grid padding X, grid padding Y, and my cells themselves will start to have padding all around them. So you have independent control over margin and padding in each one of these dimensions. Moving on to vertical grids, where we start to have even more fun. To create a vertical grid, instead of having grid X, you have grid Y. Everything else remains the same. So you have this, you still have your cells, you have your grid Y, but what we end up with is now we're able to manipulate the content in a vertical direction and use the same kind of responsive sizing classes and things like that to have that content lay out differently based on screen size. And we're getting fine-grained control now, not just on the X, but on the Y dimension. And you can imagine as you nest these things together, that gives you full two-dimensional control. One caveat I want to lay out related to the Y grid, to the vertical grid, is that if you think about the way the browser lays out elements, when it lays out block elements or it lays out flex parent elements, by default, it'll use all the horizontal space. And so what that means is it's easy to create a grid in that direction because your parent, in this case, your grid Y or your grid X, for example, or if you had in the older version a row, is automatically going to fill up the available space. Vertically, the browser behaves differently by default. You, by default, will only fill out the space necessary for your content. What that means is that if we want to slice and dice that space, we actually need to set the height on the containing grid. So in this example, I've set an explicit height with a style. Much more commonly, what you're going to want to do is set your height to be either the height of the container or the height of the viewport if you're on your outside frame. And in fact, that's so common that we have a helper class for that. So the GridFrame class allows you to pin the height of your grid so that you can do a vertical grid. So for grid Y, for GridFrame, if you're at the outermost level, what it's going to do is it's going to pin to the height of your viewport. So it's going to create it's going to make this grid exactly the height of your viewport. And if you're nested down, it's going to pin to the height of the container that it's inside. So what that does is that makes it super easy to create one of these advanced application layouts, for example, where you have like a sticky header, sticky footer, some independently scrolling content inside of it. All you'll do is you have this header would be, for example, a shrink cell, something that's going to shrink to the size of the content inside of it. Footer, same idea. Body can take up whatever space it has available to it. If we look at what that looks like, this is a more complicated example, but the structural level on the outside is exactly that. It has a header that is shrinking. It has a footer that is shrinking. It has some content inside. And we'll look at the inner pieces of this in a sec, but what you can see to start with is just how that works with each of the header and the footer is taking up exactly the space it needs, no more, and the body is taking up whatever is left over. Now, what this more complicated example is also going to show you is that you can allow independent pieces within that to scroll independently. So what we have here is we have this header, we have two independently scrolling cells inside of it. We have a sidebar that's going to scroll, and we have a body that's going to scroll. The way that we implement that is using a class called a cell block. So each one of these cells is not only a cell, but it's also a cell block Y. And we have responsive classes on this. I'll talk about that in a sec. But the core is this cell block Y. That's what is saying, hey, this thing is going to independently scroll in the Y direction. Now, because this is the XY grid, of course, there's also a cell block X. We have an example of that up here where it scrolls horizontally in the X direction. So you can have cell block Y, you can have cell block X. It allows you to create these advanced application layouts in really quite a small amount of code. If we look at the structural level of this code, it's not very many lines of HTML. And I'm not doing any custom CSS on these things. So there's two things more detailed that I want to talk about here. One is the responsive piece. So this type of independently scrolling layout is awesome for desktops. Doesn't work as well on a mobile device. But since all of these classes are responsive, you can do this for larger screens and still fall back to a pure vertical scrolling model in small screens. That's what this example does by having each of these apply only in the medium size and up. The one other caveat I want to put out there for you is when you're nesting things down, if you have a vertical grid containing a horizontal grid containing vertical cell blocks. Basically, if your grid goes one way and your cell blocks are going another, you're going to need to sort of tell that grid, hey, you know what? You shouldn't handle scrolling anymore because your cell blocks are going to. And the way that you do that is you nest it inside of a cell block container. If that explanation is a little confusing, I apologize. I'm still trying to figure out what the right explanation is for this. This ended up being driven out of the guts or the details needed to achieve the outcome. Basically, what we're doing is, by default, a horizontal grid wraps its content. And what we're doing by putting it inside of a cell block container is saying, hey, forget about that. You don't need to wrap because your children are going to wrap. Nesting these things works as well. So a situation we have right now in a client project we're working on, we have kind of an outer layout that has a header and a body. And then each page has its own layout that it's putting into the body. Some of those themselves need to be frames that have scrolling panels and things like that. Super simple, super easy to nest, right? You have this outer frame, which is pinning to the height of the viewport, a header, and then this body area that is auto-sized. You want to nest another frame inside of it. All you do, grid Y, grid frame. Since it's nested inside, the grid frame is going to go to 100% of the available space rather than pinning to the size of the viewport. And then you can do things inside of it. So in this example, we have our outer header, sort of inner body and footer, and then that inner cell itself contains a shrinking subheader and independently scrolling body. So we're able to nest our frames down to create arbitrarily complex layouts. And of course, like all of Foundation, the XY grid plays nice with sass. We build these grid classes using sass mixins. So if you want to take, for example, a responsive grid like this, where you have a grid X with a small, full width, small cell, medium 6, basically these are full width on small and half width on medium. You want to recreate that in semantic classes. You can simply include the mixins, you include the XY grid for the grid sec part, include your cell-based classes, and then at the medium breakpoint, include the size that you need it to be. With that, I think it's time to go into any questions that we may have. So let me open it up to all sorts of questions. So Bob asked, does the XY grid replace the existing flex grid? We are asserting that the XY grid is the way forward. This is a more powerful grid than either the existing flex grid or what I've been calling the traditional flex grid or the float grid. So for new projects, it is certainly what we're recommending. That said, we have deprecated the previous grid. We have not removed the previous grid. So if you have an existing project, you can still include the previous flex grid. You can build, if you're using sass, just keep importing the same things that you were importing rather than importing the XY grid classes, and you can use it. You can also, for migration purposes, have both of them in place at the same time and start moving things over bit by bit. So there's no removal of the old flex grid, though with new installs it's turned off by default. The thing that I would say is the XY grid is both more powerful in terms of the options that it opens up. It's also it's better architected in the sense that the older grids, while they allowed deep nesting and things like that, you could quickly get into odd corner cases and end up with very hard to figure out and resolve bugs. If you got down 2 or 3 levels of nesting and you were layering things in, the XY grid doesn't have nearly as many of those challenges. Kate asks, how long until we drop the older grids completely? The older grids will be alive throughout the Foundation 6 series, and we do plan to do a better job of continuing to maintain Foundation 6 for bug fixes after 7 releases than we did with 5. There were definitely some issues there and some turnover on the core team and things like that ended up with problems with that. We do not expect the older grids to be in Foundation 7. We expect Foundation 7 to be XY grid plus starting to layer in CSS grid as well.